In the gilded heart of Chicago's Gold Coast, where history is etched in limestone and fortunes are as fickle as the winds off Lake Michigan, a person's worth was often calculated by their last name or their latest acquisition. For Elara Vance, a 25-year-old waitress, her worth was measured in aching feet and the ever-present metallic scent of polish from the silverware she meticulously rolled. She was a phantom in a black and white uniform, gliding through rooms of staggering opulence, serving canapes to people whose shoes cost more than her rent. But Elara guarded a secret, a voice silenced by tragedy, a gift locked away in a vault of grief she no longer dared to open. This is the story of a single night, a lavish gala, and a man who sought to shatter an ordinary girl, only to discover that her spirit, like her voice, was anything but. It's a story of how the most profound melody isn't sung for an audience, but for the survival of a dream. The city of Chicago was an orchestra of contradictions. The mournful wail of a blues saxophone from a downtown club, the percussive clang of the L train on its elevated tracks, the relentless, driving tempo of ambition on the trading floor. Elara Vance, however, only heard the quiet, discordant notes of her own life. The hiss of the espresso machine at the Astor Room, the rhythmic squeak of her worn-out shoes on the marble floors, the anxious jackhammer beat of her heart every time she looked at the calendar. The grand arias of her past were gone, buried beneath 7 years of loss and the crushing weight of a promise she had made to her parents. The Astor Room was the crown jewel of North Michigan Avenue, a fine dining establishment nestled within a landmark hotel. It was a place of hushed tones and heavy drapery, where the city's old money and new tech titans converged. Its towering windows offered a majestic view of the historic water tower, a stoic survivor of the Great Fire, a view that was a constant, silent reminder of the city's and her own capacity for resilience. During her shifts, Elara moved with a self-taught grace, an economy of motion that made her nearly invisible. She was the warm smile that never faltered, the deft hand that whisked away an empty plate, the soft voice that inquired, "Would you care for another glass?" She was a function, a cog in the grand machine of luxury, and she had come to prefer it that way. Invisibility was a sanctuary. Her life had not always been this quiet fugue. There was a before, a time saturated with light, warmth, and the glorious sound of music. The before was a modest two-flat in Lincoln Park, a home whose walls seemed to vibrate with the power of two magnificent voices. Her father, a celebrated baritone at the Lyric Opera of Chicago, and her mother, a gifted soprano who chose to teach, had filled her world with harmony. For them, music was not a career. It was the very fabric of their existence. It was how they loved, argued, and prayed. Elara had been their cherished prodigy. Her first language was melody. Before she could read words, she could read a musical score. By the age of 10, she was mastering Schubert. By 17, she was a phenomenon, the youngest ever recipient of the prestigious Sarah Tucker Study Grant, an award that marked her as one of the most promising young sopranos in the nation. A full scholarship to the Juilliard School in New York wasn't just a possibility, it was an inevitability. Renowned conductors had attended her recitals, their faces etched with awe, calling her voice a once-in-a-generation instrument. Her future was a brilliant, soaring crescendo. Then came the silence. It descended on a frigid night in January, a patch of black ice on an unlit road, a semi-truck that lost control, and a final terrible crash that was the last discordant note in her parents' beautiful duet. Elara, home with a vicious case of bronchitis, had been spared. Her younger brother Ben, then just 12, had been at a robotics club meeting. In an instant, they were orphans. The music died that night. The light in their world was extinguished. The grand piano in their living room became a polished ebony tombstone. Elara's grief was a complicated, jagged thing. The bronchitis that had saved her life had also settled deep in her chest, and in the aftermath of the tragedy, it morphed into a chronic, rasping cough. Doctors called it psychosomatic, a physical manifestation of trauma. Her voice, once a clear, resonant bell, capable of filling a concert hall, was reduced to a fragile, unpredictable whisper. The mere thought of singing, of pushing air from her lungs in that familiar way triggered a violent coughing fit, a painful reminder of her body's betrayal. The inheritance was a pittance. After the medical bills and funeral costs were paid, Ilara and Ben were left with just enough to secure a small, cramped apartment in a less fashionable part of the city. At 18, she became Ben's legal guardian. Juilliard dissolved into an impossible, painful fantasy. Survival became the only composition she had to learn. Now at 25, she was a veteran of the service industry. Her hands, once praised for their expressive grace during a performance, were now calloused and dry. They were strong hands, capable of carrying a heavy tray of cocktails, but they no longer knew the language of gesture that accompanied an aria. Her entire world had contracted to the two-bedroom apartment she shared with Ben, and the relentless, grinding need to keep their small boat from sinking. Ben, now a lanky, brilliant 19-year-old with their father's thoughtful eyes, was her entire reason for being. He was the quiet, introverted one, but his mind was a supernova of code and algorithms. He moved with a startling ferocity through the digital world, seeing patterns and solutions others missed. He was her living legacy, the continuation of the brilliance that had once defined their family. "Hey, Elle!" Ben's voice pulled her from her reverie. She was sitting at their small kitchen table, staring at a printout from the Illinois Institute of Technology. Ben had been accepted into their prestigious summer incubator program for his app, Aura, a revolutionary navigation tool for the visually impaired that used sonic feedback and AI to describe the world. It was an opportunity that could change countless lives, and his own. "Hey, kiddo," she said, forcing a bright smile as she folded the paper. He came over, his gaze falling on the stack of overdue bills she'd been trying to juggle. "Another final notice?" he asked, his voice laced with a familiar worry. "Just the usual," she lied, a knot tightening in her stomach. The incubator program wasn't just an honor. It came with a steep price tag. A $10,000 fee for server space, development licenses, and mentorship was due in 3 weeks. It was a sum so monumentally out of reach, it felt like a cosmic joke. Ben knew. He always knew. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle. "We don't have to do it, you know. I can get a job. Maybe at the Astor Room with you." A cold dread, sharp and suffocating, washed over Ilara. The thought of Ben, with his brilliant, vibrant mind, being worn down by the same life that was slowly erasing her, was unbearable. The thought of his gifted hands polishing glasses instead of writing code. It felt like a betrayal of their parents, of the future they had dreamed for him. "Don't you dare say that," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "You are doing this program. I'll figure it out. I always do." He glanced toward the corner of the living room, where 2 large cloth-draped rectangles stood against the wall. They were custom-built travel cases, containing the one thing Ilara had refused to sell, her parents' performance attire, her mother's gowns and her father's tailcoats, preserved in cedar and silence. They were albatrosses, constant, voiceless reminders of the life she had lost. Ben had never once heard her truly sing. "You could," he started, then stopped, knowing he was treading on sacred, painful ground. "Don't," she warned softly. "That's not an option." The next day at work, the atmosphere was electric with tension. The entire restaurant had been booked for a private gala celebrating the launch of Elysian, a new virtual reality platform. The host was Sterling Blackwood, the 38-year-old tech billionaire behind the project. He was a notorious figure in the city's elite circles. Impossibly wealthy, with a chiseled jaw and cold, calculating eyes, he was known for his ostentatious displays of power and his casual cruelty towards anyone he considered beneath him, which was, by all accounts, almost everyone. Mr. Dubois, the restaurant's perpetually anxious manager, gathered the staff for a pre-shift briefing. His face was pale. "Listen up, everyone. Tonight is not a regular service. This is Sterling Blackwood. That means 0 mistakes, nothing out of place. He's known for trying to get people fired for sport. Be professional, be invisible, and whatever you do, do not engage with him unless he speaks to you first. Are we clear?" A nervous murmur of assent rippled through the staff. Ilara felt that familiar knot of dread tighten in her stomach. It was just one night. 8 hours of smiling and nodding and pretending she didn't exist. She could do that. For Ben, she could do anything. She just had to get through the shift, collect her tips, and somehow find a miracle worth $10,000. The gala began precisely at 8 o'clock. A river of wealth and influence flowed into the Astor Room, a parade of haute couture gowns, bespoke suits, and jewels that glittered with a cold, predatory light. The air grew thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of self-congratulatory chatter. Ilara, tray in hand, navigated the sea of bodies, her face a polite, neutral mask. She offered flutes of vintage champagne and bites of truffle-infused delicacies, her movements fluid and efficient. She saw him across the room. Sterling Blackwood stood at the epicenter of it all, a panther in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. He didn't just occupy the space, he dominated it. He possessed the easy arrogance of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. His laughter was a sharp, barking sound that sliced through the noise, demanding attention. Clinging to his arm was his girlfriend, Cassandra Thorne. She was beautiful in a severe, sculpted way, her raven hair pulled back in a sleek chignon. She wore a crimson dress that shimmered like liquid fire. Her smile, however, seemed painted on, a carefully constructed facade of adoration that didn't quite reach her cold, ambitious eyes. Ilara's primary duty was to keep the champagne flowing at the main table where Sterling held court. This required her to be close, to overhear snippets of their conversation. Flew the entire board to Necker Island for the weekend. The deal was done before the jet fuel cooled, Sterling was boasting, a smug grin on his face. Only you, darling, a sycophantic friend cooed. As Ilara leaned in to refill a glass, her eyes met Cassandra's for a fleeting second. A flicker of something crossed Cassandra's face. Not recognition, not yet, but a faint, puzzled curiosity, as if Ilara were a half-forgotten face from a dream. Ilara quickly looked away, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. She felt an irrational sense of danger, a primal instinct to retreat into the shadows. She spent the next hour avoiding the main table, busying herself with clearing duties at the periphery of the room. But Mr. Dubois, ever watchful, intercepted her. Vance, table 1 needs more champagne? Now! With a resigned sigh, Ilara grabbed a fresh bottle and a polished cloth and made her way back into the lion's den. As she approached, Sterling was telling another story, his voice laced with casual disdain. So I told the architect, if you can't grasp the basic concept of a cantilevered infinity pool, maybe you should stick to designing garden sheds. The look on his face, priceless. His friends roared with laughter. Cassandra offered a tight, practiced smile. Ilara moved to Sterling's side, murmuring, "Excuse me, sir," as she reached for his glass. It was then that Cassandra looked at her again, properly this time. Her perfectly arched eyebrows drew together. The polite mask of the hostess fell away, replaced by genuine, unadulterated shock. Her green eyes widened and her mouth opened slightly. "My God," she breathed, the sound barely audible over the din. Sterling stopped mid-sentence. "What is it, darling?" Cassandra didn't answer him. Her eyes were locked on Ilara. "I know you," she said, her voice a strange mix of disbelief and accusation. Ilara froze, the heavy champagne bottle suddenly feeling like a lead weight in her hand. Her mind raced. "Where? How?" You're Ilara Vance," Cassandra said, the name sounding alien and out of place in this opulent setting. The blood drained from Ilara's face, and now she remembered. Cassandra Thorne. She hadn't been a Thorne then. She'd been Cassandra Peters. She had been in the pre-college program at the Chicago Music Institute with her. Cassandra had been a gifted mezzo-soprano, technically proficient and fiercely ambitious. But she had always been second best. In every masterclass, every competition, Ilara's raw, emotive talent and the unique timbre of her voice had eclipsed Cassandra's rigid perfection. The memory of Cassandra's thin-lipped smile after Ilara had won the concerto competition came flooding back. A smile of feigned congratulations that hid a core of simmering, bitter envy. I'm sorry, ma'am. I think you're mistaken," Ilara stammered, her training kicking in. Deny, deflect, disappear. Sterling looked from his stunned girlfriend to the flustered waitress with growing amusement. "You know her. How deliciously common." "We were at the Music Institute together," Cassandra said, still staring at Ilara as if she were a ghost. "In the vocal program, She was, she was the best one there. A prodigy. The last word was tinged with a complex blend of old resentment and current astonishment. Everyone said she was going to be the next Renee Fleming. A slow, predatory smile spread across Sterling Blackwood's face. His eyes, the color of polished steel, lit up with a cruel sort of inspiration. He saw the situation not as a strange coincidence, but as a perfect opportunity for entertainment. The party was starting to lull. He needed a spectacle. A prodigy, you say? He drawled, his voice carrying across the table and silencing the nearby conversations. Is that so? An opera prodigy serving me champagne? He let out a short, sharp laugh. How the mighty have fallen. What happened, Vance? Did you run out of talent? Ilara felt the eyes of the entire table on her. Her face burned with humiliation. She wanted the floor to swallow her whole. My life changed, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Her parents died, Cassandra supplied. A hint of something, was it guilt, in her tone. It was a tragedy. Sterling waved a dismissive hand, uninterested in the dreary details of tragedy. Well, what a coincidence, he said, gesturing towards a small, elegantly lit stage in the corner of the room. It had been set up for the product demonstration later in the evening. A single, sleek microphone stood on a stand. We have a stage, a microphone, and apparently a world-class singer in our midst. He stood up, tapping a knife against his glass to get the attention of the entire room. Ladies and gentlemen, he called out. The chatter died down as dozens of curious, wealthy faces turned towards him. We are in for a special treat tonight. It seems our lovely waitress, he gestured condescendingly at Ilara, is none other than Ilara Vance, a former opera prodigy. Let's have her sing something for us. A confused, intrigued murmur rippled through the crowd. Ilara's world tilted on its axis. This couldn't be happening. Her carefully constructed wall of anonymity was being torn down brick by painful brick in front of an audience of the city's most powerful people. Her boss, Mr. Dubois, was watching from the sidelines, his face a pale mask of horror, trapped between defending his employee and appeasing a client who could ruin the restaurant with a single phone call. No, Ilara said, the words small but firm. I can't. Oh, don't be shy, Sterling sneered. A little Mozart, perhaps. A little something to earn your tip. He was enjoying this. The power, the public humiliation. It was a drug to him. He was turning her personal tragedy into a party trick. The silence in the room stretched, thick and suffocating. Every eye was on her, waiting. The world had shrunk to the space between her and Sterling Blackwood. The opulent room, the curious faces, the panoramic view of the city. It all faded into a blurry periphery. All Ilara could see were Sterling's mocking eyes and the smug, triumphant curl of his lip. All she could feel was the thundering of her own heart, a frantic, panicked drumbeat against her ribs. No, she repeated, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. I'm working. I can't. A small, tickling cough started in her throat. Sterling chuckled, a low, patronizing sound. Oh, I think your manager will forgive you. Dubois, he called out, not even bothering to look for him. Your girl here is going to provide some entertainment. You can spare her for a few minutes, can't you? Mr. Dubois appeared at Ilara's elbow, his face ashen. He gave Ilara a desperate, pleading look. Mr. Blackwood, he began, his voice trembling slightly. It's not a request, Sterling said, his tone dropping its playful edge and hardening into cold steel. It was the voice of a man used to absolute obedience. She will sing. The steel in his voice shot straight into Ilara's spine. A flicker of her old pride, the pride of the girl who could command a concert hall, sparked in the face of his tyranny. I don't sing anymore, she said, her chin lifting slightly. Sterling's eyes narrowed. He was not accustomed to defiance, especially from someone he considered to be less than nothing. The public nature of her refusal was a direct challenge to his authority, and he couldn't stand it. He decided to change tactics, to make it transactional, to cheapen her refusal and turn it into a matter of price. Is that it? He said, his voice dripping with condescension. Are you holding out for payment? Fine. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a thick carbon fiber wallet. He extracted a stack of crisp $100 bills held together by a platinum money clip. He peeled off 10 of them. $1,000, he said, fanning the bills out. Sing one song, and it's yours. That's probably more than you make in a month, isn't it? The casual cruelty of the gesture, the way he equated her deepest trauma with a cash transaction, sent a wave of nausea through her. The faces in the crowd were a mixture of pity, discomfort, and morbid curiosity. They were watching a public execution of her dignity. Cassandra looked down at her plate, unable to meet Alara's eyes. "No, thank you," Alara said, her voice tight. The $1,000 was a lot of money. It would cover their rent for 2 months, but it wouldn't buy her soul. Sterling's smirk widened. He was enjoying the game. "Not enough? You drive a hard bargain, Vance. A real businesswoman." He peeled off more bills, his movements slow and deliberate, designed for maximum humiliation. "Let's make it $5,000 for one song. 5 minutes of your time." $5,000. The number hung in the air. That was half of what she needed for Ben. Halfway to his dream, her resolve wavered for a microsecond. She saw Ben's face in her mind, his hopeful eyes when he looked at the IIT acceptance letter. "I'll figure it out," she had told him. Was this it? Was this the universe offering a deal with the devil? She looked at the money in his hand, then at his face. The sneer was still there. This wasn't an offer. It was a leash. He wanted to own her talent, to own her past and parade it around for his own amusement. He wanted to prove that everyone, even a prodigy, had a price. "My answer is no," she said, her voice shaking but clear. A dry, rasping cough escaped her lips. Sterling let out an exasperated sigh, as if dealing with a petulant child. He looked around at his guests, a silent appeal for them to witness this absurdity. Then his eyes landed on Cassandra, who was now staring at Alara with a complicated expression. An idea sparked in his mind. "Tell me, darling," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "This tragedy, the parents, was there anyone else? A sibling, perhaps?" Cassandra paled. "Sterling, don't." "She has a younger brother," Cassandra admitted quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "Ben." Sterling's predatory smile returned, wider and more menacing than before. He had found her weakness. "A brother. Wonderful. And I'm sure he has needs. Schools to attend, things that cost money, things that a waitress's salary can't quite cover." Alara felt like he had reached into her chest and squeezed her heart. He knew nothing about Ben, but he understood the universal levers of desperation. He tossed the $5,000 onto the table, where it landed with a soft, obscene rustle next to a half-eaten shrimp cocktail. Then he pulled out the entire stack of bills from his wallet. He didn't count them this time. $10,000, he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush that was somehow more commanding than a shout. "Right here, in cash. All of it yours. Just sing one song. Anything you like. Think about it, Alara. $10,000. What could that do for your brother? What kind of future could that buy him?" $10,000. The exact amount. The precise number that had been haunting her waking thoughts and her dreams. It was the key to Ben's future, sitting there on a table offered by a man who despised her. It was a golden apple laced with the most potent poison. The room was utterly silent. Everyone understood the stakes now. This was no longer a party game. It was a brutal moral calculus. Her pride versus her brother's dream. Her integrity versus his opportunity. She looked at the money. She saw the IIT acceptance letter. She saw Ben's complex diagrams and lines of code pinned all over his bedroom wall. Vibrant, alive, full of a promise that she was failing to nurture. She remembered his face when he'd offered to quit school to join her in the gray, soul-crushing world of service. The thought was a physical pain. She could feel the weight of every stare, the judgment, the pity. She could feel Sterling's victory before it even happened. He was boxing her in, using her love for her brother as a weapon against her. Her hands, clenched into fists at her sides, began to tremble. Her breath hitched. A single hot tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Slowly, deliberately, she unclenched her fists. She looked at Mr. Dubois, who gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. absolving her. She looked at Cassandra, who finally met her gaze, her eyes swimming with a mixture of horror and shame. Cassandra had started this, perhaps not intending this level of cruelty, but she had unleashed the monster, and now couldn't stop it. Finally, Alara looked at Sterling Blackwood. There was no fear in her eyes anymore. There was no pleading. There was just a vast, cold emptiness that was slowly catching fire. "Fine," she said, her voice a dead, hollow thing. "I'll sing." A wave of relief and renewed excitement went through the crowd. Sterling beamed, triumphant. He had won. He had proven his point. Everything and everyone had a price. "Excellent," he boomed. "To the stage, then. Let's hear what $10,000 sounds like." Alara didn't look at the money on the table. She turned her back on it, on him, on all of them, and began the long, lonely walk towards a small stage in the corner of the room. Each step was a lifetime. She was walking past the ghost of her 17-year-old self, past the wreckage of the car accident, past 7 years of silence and grief. She was walking into the heart of her greatest fear. Not for money, not for them, but for Ben. And as she walked, something inside her began to shift. The humiliation, the shame, the grief. It all began to turn to heat, to transform into something else entirely. It was becoming fuel. The walk to the stage felt like scaling a mountain. The plush carpet muffled her footsteps, but in her ears the silence of the room was a deafening roar. She was acutely aware of every set of eyes on her back, every whisper she couldn't quite hear. They were expecting a spectacle, a clumsy, out-of-practice waitress fumbling through a simple tune, a pathetic performance to justify their host's cruel wager. They expected her to fail. Sterling Blackwood was counting on it. She reached the small carpeted stage. The single microphone on its stand looked like a gallows. She stepped up, the simple motion feeling alien and strange. Her waitress apron felt absurd, a coarse, utilitarian garment in the presence of such naked vulnerability. She smoothed it over her black trousers, her hands shaking so badly she had to clench them at her sides. A few titters rippled through the crowd. Sterling, standing near the front with his arms crossed, wore a smirk of pure satisfaction. "Any decade now, Vance," he called out. Alara closed her eyes. The noise of the room faded away. The faces, the judgment, the $10,000, it all receded. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw it all. The flashing lights of the ambulance, the sterile white walls of the hospital waiting room, the suffocating scent of funeral lilies, the dust sheet she'd thrown over the piano, a final act of surrender. The grief was a physical thing, a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She reached out a trembling hand and adjusted the microphone. Her throat was dry, tight with anxiety. The tickling cough threatened to return. For a moment, her mind was a complete blank. 7 years of silence had built a fortress around her talent. She couldn't remember a single song. The panic rose in her throat, thick and choking. This was it, the ultimate humiliation. Sterling would win. And then she thought of Ben. She saw his face, not full of pity, but full of fierce, unwavering belief. She saw him at his computer, his brow furrowed in concentration, his fingers flying across the keyboard with a certainty she hadn't felt in years. She thought of his offer to sacrifice his own dream for her. The love she felt for him was a powerful, surging force, a tide that crashed against the fortress of her trauma. She took a deep, shuddering breath, and then another. She didn't try to remember a piece. She didn't try to perform. She just let the silence inside her expand. And in that silence, a melody began to stir. She opened her eyes and looked out, not at the crowd, but through them, towards the window overlooking the city lights. She didn't need a piano. She didn't need an orchestra. Her voice had always been enough. The first note that emerged from her lips was not loud or forceful. It was a single, pure, perfectly sustained tone, as soft and clear as moonlight. It cut through the expectant hush of the room like a silver blade. There was no music, no accompaniment, just the sound of her voice, a cappella, filling the space. She had chosen O mio babino caro from Puccini's Gianni Schicchi. It was an aria of desperate pleading, a daughter begging her father for love. But tonight, it was not a plea. It was a reclamation. The sound that poured from her was not the fragile, broken whisper of a traumatized girl. It was the voice of a woman forged in fire. The years of silence, of suppressed grief and unspoken rage had not destroyed her instrument. They had seasoned it, imbued it with a depth and richness that a 17-year-old prodigy could never have possessed. The notes were colored with the dark, velvety hues of sorrow, the bright, soaring silver of hope, the fiery crimson of defiance. Sterling Blackwood's smirk vanished, wiped clean from his face as if by a physical blow. His jaw went slack. This was not the fumbling waitress he had expected. This was a force of nature. Ilara's body was no longer her own. It was a conduit for 7 years of pent-up sorrow and love. Her posture, once slumped in defeat, was now erect and powerful, her hands clasped loosely before her. Her head was held high, her eyes fixed on some distant point, but her face was a mask of sublime, heartbreaking emotion. The music told her story. It was the frantic chaos of the accident, the dark despair of the aftermath, the grinding toil of her daily life, the fierce, protective love for her brother. Every note was infused with a raw, visceral emotion that technical perfection alone could never achieve. Cassandra Thorne, for all her conservatory training, could never have sung like this. This wasn't just a performance. It was an exorcism. The guests were frozen, transfixed. The cynical, jaded faces of Chicago's 1% were stripped bare, replaced by expressions of raw, unadulterated awe. They were no longer watching a waitress. They were witnessing an artist in the throes of creation, bearing her soul for them to see. Across the room, an older gentleman with a shock of white hair and kind, intelligent eyes stood up from his table. His name was Maestro Julian Croft, the legendary music director of the Lyric Opera of Chicago. He had been invited as a favor to the hotel's owner and had been dreading the vapid evening. He had watched the cruel spectacle unfold with quiet disgust. When Ilara had walked to the stage, he hadn't recognized her. He had expected to hear something broken. But this was not broken. This was devastatingly whole. It was the singing of a master who had journeyed through hell and returned with its fire still burning in her soul. Tears welled in his eyes as he listened, not just to the notes, but to the story they told. The aria reached its climax, a soaring, passionate cry that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of everyone present. A note of such purity and power, it felt as if it could shatter the great plate glass windows. Then the music softened, descending into a final tender phrase that hung in the air like a prayer before fading into perfect, resonant silence. The silence that followed was absolute. It was profound, heavy, sacred. No one moved. No one breathed. For a full 10 seconds, the only sound was the distant wail of a siren from the streets far below. Ilara's hands fell to her sides. She opened her eyes, her chest heaving, sweat beading on her forehead. She was back in the room, the spell broken. She looked out at the sea of stunned faces, her vision blurry with unshed tears. Then one person began to clap. It was Maestro Croft. His applause was slow, deliberate, and loud in the silent room. Then another person joined in, and another. And then the entire room erupted. It wasn't polite, perfunctory applause. It was a roar. It was a standing ovation. It was a thunderous, heartfelt acknowledgement of the staggering talent they had just witnessed. People were on their feet, their faces alight with an emotion none of them had expected to feel tonight. Genuine wonder. Ilara stared at her hands, the hands of a waitress. The wall was gone. The fortress had been leveled. She was free. The applause crashed over Ilara in waves, a sound she hadn't heard directed at her in years. It was overwhelming, disorienting. She felt exposed, as if she had laid her soul bare for all to see. She started to step down from the stage, her only instinct to flee, to escape back into the shadows of the kitchen. But before she could move, Maestro Croft was pushing his way through the crowd. He bypassed Sterling Blackwood without a glance and came to stand before the stage, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Brava," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out a hand to help her down. "My dear child, that was not merely a song, that was a resurrection." Maestro Croft, she breathed, shocked to see the legendary conductor. She had posters of him in her childhood bedroom. He ignored the stunned audience, his focus entirely on her. I remember a young girl years ago at an institute competition, a voice of impossible promise, Elara Vance. The use of her full name, spoken with such reverence by a man of his stature, sent a murmur through the room. People who hadn't known her name were now repeating it in whispers. Elara Vance. What you have, he continued, his voice ringing with authority. It's more than talent. It has deepened. It has been tempered by life. It is profound. He then turned to face the captivated crowd. For those of you who do not know, he announced, his voice carrying the weight of a pronouncement, this young woman was the most singularly gifted soprano I have heard in this city in 20 years. She was destined for the world's greatest stages, before tragedy forced her to walk a different path. He looked directly at Sterling Blackwood, and his kind eyes turned to ice. A path that some, it seems, would mistake for a circus, for their own callous amusement. The rebuke was sharp, public, and utterly damning. Sterling's face, which had been pale with shock, now flushed a deep, mottled red. He was no longer the ringmaster. He was the fool. In a room where reputation was currency, Maestro Croft had just bankrupted him. All his wealth, all his power, could not undo the fact that he had been exposed as a classless, cruel bully in front of his peers, his girlfriend, and one of the city's most respected cultural figures. The crowd's energy shifted palpably. The awe for Elara curdled into contempt for Sterling. They had witnessed something beautiful and true, and his attempt to defile it now seemed grotesque. It was Cassandra who made the final move. The brittle poise she had maintained all evening finally shattered. She walked over to the table, her movements stiff. She picked up the wad of $10,000. For a moment, Elara thought she might offer it to her, a pathetic apology. Instead, Cassandra walked over to Sterling, her green eyes blazing with a fire he had probably never seen. You are a small, pathetic man, she said, her voice low but carrying in the charged silence. And then, with a flick of her wrist, she threw the entire stack of bills in his face. The $100 bills fluttered down around him like grotesque confetti, landing on his pristine suit and the expensive carpet at his feet. A collective gasp went through the room. We're done, Cassandra said, her voice clear and final. She turned, gave Elara one long, unreadable look, a look that held a universe of regret, envy, and a flicker of newfound respect. And then she walked away, head held high, right out of the gala and out of Sterling Blackwood's life. The humiliation was now complete. Sterling stood alone, bills scattered around his feet, his girlfriend gone, his guests staring at him with open disdain. He had tried to embarrass a waitress and had ended up destroying his own launch party, his engagement, and his social standing in a single catastrophic miscalculation. Empowered by Croft's validation and Cassandra's defiance, Elara felt the last of her fear fall away. She stood up straight, her spine a rod of steel. She walked not towards the exit, but back towards the table where this all began. She stopped in front of a speechless Sterling Blackwood. She looked at the money on the floor, then back at his face. My voice is not for sale, she said, her voice quiet but ringing with the force of the final note she had sung. And it is certainly not for your amusement. She didn't wait for a response. She turned her back on him, on the wreckage of his party, and walked towards the staff exit, leaving behind the sound of her own name being spoken with wonder and the sight of a billionaire utterly and completely diminished. As she pushed through the door into the blessed anonymity of the service corridor, she felt not shame, but a profound and liberating sense of peace. She hadn't earned $10,000. She had earned something far more valuable, herself. The sterile, fluorescent-lit service corridor felt like a decompression chamber. Elara leaned against the cool metal of the kitchen door, the adrenaline from her performance draining away, leaving a profound humming exhaustion in its wake. The distant roar of applause was still a faint echo in her ears, a surreal soundtrack to her escape. She had walked through fire and had not been burned. She had been reforged. The journey home on the L train was a blur, descending from the glittering heights of the Gold Coast to the rumbling, everyday rhythm of her neighborhood, felt like returning to Earth from another planet. The city's usual cacophony, the screech of train wheels, the murmur of late-night commuters, the distant wail of a police car, sounded different tonight. It was no longer a relentless assault of noise. For the first time in 7 years, she could hear the spaces between the sounds, the quiet rhythms and unintended harmonies. It was as if her performance had retuned not just her own soul, but the world around her. She walked into the apartment she shared with Ben. He was awake, hunched over his laptop at the kitchen table, the glow of the screen illuminating his focused expression. He looked up as she entered, his brow furrowed with worry. "Elle, you're home late. Is everything okay?" She looked at her brilliant, beloved brother, the reason for her sacrifice, the anchor of her life. She didn't know how to begin to tell him what had happened. So instead of speaking, she simply took a deep breath. She opened her mouth and sang the first few bars of Summertime from Porgy and Bess, a lullaby her mother used to sing to them. Her voice was soft, clear, and utterly free of the rasp that had plagued it for years. Ben's hands froze over his keyboard. He stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief and dawning wonder. He had never in his memory heard her sing like that. He was seeing his sister, truly seeing her, for the very first time. Not as the tired guardian or the invisible waitress, but as the powerful, breathtaking artist she was meant to be. She didn't sleep that night. She sat by the window, watching the lights of the city flicker and fade, feeling the tectonic plates of her life shifting beneath her. The next morning, she woke with a clarity she hadn't known since she was a teenager. The gray, oppressive weight that had settled on her heart after her parents' death had lifted, replaced by a quiet, steady strength. She made coffee, her movements deliberate. There was no hesitation. She knew what she had to do. Instead of putting on her black and white waitress uniform, she chose a simple pair of jeans and a clean blue blouse. She walked into the Astor Room at 10 a.m., long before the lunch service began. The dining room was empty, the chairs stacked on tables, the morning sun streaming through the panoramic windows and illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Mr. Dubois, her manager, was in his office, nursing a cup of coffee and looking utterly spent. He looked up as Ilara appeared in the doorway, and his face was a mixture of awe and apprehension. "Vance," he said, his voice quiet. "I thought you might not come in." "I came to quit, Mr. Dubois," Ilara said, her tone gentle but firm. There was no anger, no resentment. "I can't work here anymore." Dubois nodded slowly, a deep sigh escaping him. "I don't blame you. What he did, what I let him do, it was unforgivable. I was a coward. I was so afraid of losing the restaurant's biggest account that I was willing to sacrifice you." His eyes were filled with genuine shame. "I'm sorry, Ilara." "You were in an impossible position," Ilara said, offering a grace Dubois didn't expect. "But I can't be invisible anymore. I don't think I know how." "No," Dubois agreed, a small, sad smile touching his lips. "I don't think you do." He stood and extended a hand. "For what it's worth, what you did last night, it was the most incredible thing I've ever seen. You took his ugly little game and you turned it into something beautiful. You gave everyone in that room a story they will be telling for the rest of their lives." And he was right. The story of the Astor Room soprano spread through the city's arteries like wildfire. It was too delicious, too mythic to remain a secret. It became the ultimate tale of hubris and talent, a modern-day David and Goliath played out on a makeshift stage. Sterling Blackwood's name became synonymous with public humiliation. Columns in the Chicago Tribune Society pages hinted at a tech billionaire's catastrophic launch party foul that led to a very public, very expensive dumping. His Elysian platform launched to ridicule and scathing reviews, with tech journalists gleefully recounting the story of his behavior as a preamble to critiquing his product. He had tried to expose Ilara as having a price, and had ended up proving he had no value. 2 days after Ilara quit, her phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. "Is this Ilara Vance?" a man's voice asked, warm and resonant, with the authority of someone used to commanding a stage. "Yes," she said, her heart giving a small flutter. "Ilara, this is Julian Croft." Her breath caught. "Maestro Croft," she said, sinking onto the edge of her sofa. I, I don't know how to thank you for what you said, for standing up for me. Nonsense, he said warmly. I did nothing. Your voice did all the talking. I have not stopped thinking about it since that night. The passion, the power, it was magnificent. But there was pain in it too, a deep well of it. I am only sorry you had to go through such an ordeal to find your way back to your gift. I think, she confessed, the realization dawning on her as she said it, maybe it was the only way. Maybe I had to break completely before I could heal. Perhaps, he mused, but the healing should not end there. It must be nurtured. Which brings me to the reason for my call. He paused and Alara could hear the smile in his voice. The Lyric Opera has a prestigious ensemble for emerging artists, the Ryan Opera Center. The auditions for next year's class are, unfortunately, over. However, I am the artistic director, and I find I can occasionally bend the rules when confronted with a talent that is undeniable. Alara's heart pounded against her ribs. I would like to offer you a private audition next week. A formality, really. There is a place for you at the center, Alara. It comes with a living stipend, world-class coaching, and roles on the main stage. The position is yours if you want it. The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. The Ryan Opera Center, a living stipend, a career. It was a fantasy, a dream she hadn't even allowed herself to have for 7 years. It was the entire world she had lost being handed back to her, whole and beautiful. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and silent. Maestro, I don't know what to say, she stammered, her voice thick with emotion. Say you'll think about it, he said kindly. But don't think for too long. A voice like yours belongs to the world. She hung up the phone, her mind reeling. Hope, so fierce and bright it was almost painful, bloomed in her chest. But a shadow lingered at its edge. Ben. The lyric position was a miracle, but it wouldn't start for months, and the stipend, while generous, wouldn't cover the $10,000 incubator fee that was due in 2 weeks. The familiar, crushing weight of that number settled on her once more. The next afternoon, the shadow was banished for good. A sleek courier service delivered a thick, cream-colored envelope. It bore no return address, only her name typed in an elegant font. Puzzled, she carefully opened it. Inside was a letter from a white shoe law firm on Wacker Drive and a cashier's check. Her eyes scanned the letter, her heart beginning to pound. Ms. Vance, this letter is to inform you that a technology development grant has been established in the name of your brother, Ben Vance, for his project, Aura. The grant has been created by a benefactor who was present at the private event at the Astor Room on the evening of October 26th. This individual, who wishes to remain strictly anonymous, was profoundly moved by your artistic integrity and personal strength. Believing that such brilliance deserves to be fostered in all its forms, our client has endowed this grant to cover the full development, server, and launch costs for the Aura application. Enclosed, please find a cashier's check for $10,000, made out to the Illinois Institute of Technology, to cover the deposit for the summer incubator program. Our firm will handle all future funding directly with the institution as needed. We wish you and your brother the very best. Alara stared at the letter, then at the check in her trembling hand. $10,000, it was the money, the ransom for her dignity, the price of her humiliation. And now it had come back to her, not as a weapon, but as a gift, an act of pure, anonymous grace. She sank into a chair, the letter and check clutched to her chest, and she laughed. It was a bubbling, incredulous, joyous sound. When Ben came home from his classes, he found her sitting in the living room, a strange, luminous calm about her. He saw the official-looking envelope and the check on the table, and looked at her, confused. What's all this? She didn't speak. She just pushed the documents towards him. He picked up the letter, his brow furrowed in concentration as he read. His eyes widened. He reread it as if he couldn't believe the words. He looked at the check, his jaw slack. Alara, what? How is this possible? He whispered, his voice filled with awe. She smiled, a brilliant, genuine smile that seemed to light up the entire room. I told you I'd figure it out. She stood and walked over to the 2 cloth-draped cases that had stood silent for so long. With a single fluid motion, she unzipped one and pulled out a gown of deep sapphire silk, one of her mother's favorites. She held it against herself for a moment, the cool fabric a comforting weight. She then walked to the center of their small living room, took a deep, cleansing breath, and began to sing. It wasn't a furious, defiant aria this time. It was the soft, shimmering opening notes of Morning from Grieg's Peer Gynt, a song of sunrise and new beginnings. The melody, as gentle and hopeful as the first light breaking over the lake, filled their small apartment. It was a lullaby for their grief, a hymn to their resilience. It was the music of her childhood, the love of her parents, a promise of peace. Ben stood frozen for a moment, listening. He quietly walked to his desk and returned with his laptop. He sat on the floor, and as the beautiful, healing notes washed over him, he began to code. With swift, certain strokes of his fingers, he wrote the first lines of the new module for Aura, the one he had been dreaming of for months. The symphony of their lives had begun anew. It was no longer a solo of survival. It was a duet, played out in voice and code, a testament to the unbreakable bond they shared, and a powerful reminder that even after the longest, darkest silence, music, in all its forms, will always find a way to return. That single night at the Astor Room wasn't just about a shocking performance. It was about the reclamation of a soul. Ilara's story is a powerful reminder that our true value is never determined by our job title, our bank account, or the judgment of others. It resides in our spirit, our integrity, and the hidden talents we carry within us. It shows us that a moment of profound humiliation can be transformed into a moment of ultimate triumph, and that the most powerful voice we have is our own, whether it's spoken, coded, or sung in a grand opera hall. We all have a gift we've silenced, a passion we've set aside. What's yours? If this story of resilience and redemption moved you, please give this a like and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories that inspire and empower. Please share your own stories of hidden talents in the comments below. We'd love to read them. Thank you for watching.